What's going on, guys? Coach Colin here, and if you want the absolute best insights to the podcast you love, hit that subscribe button. I'm doing this daily. I think this is the last episode of the day, because I did a few today. This is still episode 1916, John Barnthal of the Joe Rogan podcast. This clip is about communist times. I'll just read what I read. This clip is about communist times, how if people gathered, they weren't allowed to gather. They needed their papers everywhere they went. If there was a message of disagreement with what the state was doing in a play, you were executed. If you were in the audience, you were imprisoned. And if you were an actor in that play, you were imprisoned. This gives a definite window into why this guy chooses to tackle such crazy subject matter. It's because he was trained and grew up, trained and went to school in a place, which was Russia. That's where he went to school, theater school. He was trained by people who really understood how imperative it was to speak up. And they stood on that shit. They really stood on it. Even in the face of death. Like, could you imagine you're like like we think of like theater kids. Can you imagine you're like, we're about to do this play, and if the wrong people get wind of it, we might go to jail or die. And you still all look at each other and you go, worth it. Worth it. In order to get this message out to the people, it's worth it. These guys weren't making memes. They weren't doing what I'm doing right now. It's making clips. They were doing full-scale plays. And to still be able to do it and not have your voice shake throughout the whole thing is just incredible. And even as the person who wrote the play, to know that I'm going to have this play performed multiple times. And if I get this play, if I have this production go on 10 times, I am very likely to be killed. Very wild. We really don't realize how good we have it and how important it is to keep it this good. A lot of people feel like we have it really good. So it's like, don't worry if it gets a little worse. Like we compare it to other places. Well, you know, in the other place, this happens. So it's okay if this thing happens to us here. It's not. It's not okay. But anyway, let's get into the clip.
You know, look, during communist times, public gathering was outlawed. So, you know, you couldn't go to church. You couldn't get a group of people together and speak. You know, audiences were illegal unless they were politically based and controlled by the Kremlin. So there were a couple state-based theaters, state-run theaters in Moscow, one of them being the Moscow Art Theater. But they had to do pro-state shows. And the thing is a lot of these people, you know, Meyerhold, for example, he's one of the most famous Russian directors. He was lauded by the state as this, you know, unbelievable hero of the Russian theater, and you know, Stalin. They would go and they would see his plays, but then somebody looked at it, and all of a sudden they said, you know what? I think there's actually an anti-state message here. They executed him in his apartment. Oof. So actors were sent to prison for being in a play that all of a sudden somebody just deemed as anti-state. And you know, for me, you know, my main teachers, you know, they did this play called Cinzano, which was about three guys. One of them lost their moms, three best friends. One of them lost their mom, and it's just the three of them sitting in this apartment drinking a bottle of Cinzano and just sort of lamenting about this loss. And they'd been putting this play on for 30 years once they were my teachers during communist times. So they would do this play in subway tunnels, in abandoned buildings. Had they been caught, they would have been imprisoned. Anybody who was in that audience would have been imprisoned for going to watch that show. But they did it anyway because it was that vital to them. It was that important to them. And, you know, for me, you know, again, thinking, you know, I'm this like kind of tough kid from DC, and that I knew what the hell I was talking about. Like being around people that were operating with that set of stakes, where the history, the palpability of the tumultuous history that is alive in every breath in that city. Again, the beauty and the brutality. It was a game changer for me. I mean, look, man, one sort of brief anecdote. When I first went over there, I think my third day there was my birthday, and again, just I lived in a place called Park Kulturi, which is Gorky Park. It's kind of a pretty rough, sort of shitty area in
That story that he's about to tell, whoo, buddy, that is a wild story. But just what he just went through, how they had to perform it, in hiding, and if you got caught, you went to prison. Actor and audience member. It's wild. It actually reminds me of out in Canada. There's a comedian, his name's Ben Bankus. And in the past 3 years, everything that was going on, stand-up comedy was kind of outlawed. You weren't allowed to have audiences. You weren't allowed to have a crowd gather. You weren't allowed to do it at all. And he decided that wasn't going to happen. And he would go out every week and he would have these shows in a park, and people would all come and they just sit on a hill because it was summertime. And, they would have the people be distanced enough, and, they'd use a megaphone, or they'd just yell, or they'd do what they had to do. And eventually they got a little bit of a sound system and stuff. But every show he did, he would get a fine, like for money, like a lot of money. I think like at the end of it, not even at the end of it, like into it, like a quarter into him doing these shows, I think he was fined something like $10,000, like just a lot of money, just all the time. Every time they would come and they'd give him fines. And it's funny enough, Russell Peters, the comedian, I don't know if you ever heard of him, he actually paid it off for him because he just liked what he was doing. But it's just crazy to think like that happening was like, oh my God, can't believe it. They're handing him a fine and now he has to pay money. That's, oh my God. And they're walking away. Oh my, I can't believe this. Imagine if they just rounded up everybody and said, you're all going to jail. All of you are going to jail. It's just wild, man. Just wild to think about. Yeah. I didn't want to make this too long, but it's just like a little window into why this guy is so intense with what he goes after. Like if you watch his podcast, it's serious stuff. It's intense. It's all intense, and it makes perfect sense because where he went to school in Moscow, his theater school. He went at a time when it was like he could still feel the effects. Like you needed your papers wherever you went. If you didn't have your papers, you weren't getting into certain places. And here in North America, we kind of act like that could never happen. But there's so many places in the world that you can point to where it's like, it's happening. It did happen. It's possible. And we just choose to ignore it. I just find it odd. But just a little window into how things are in some places, how things could possibly be. I won't say more than that. I don't have my papers. I'm out. Peace.